Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5. Just a quick point before we get started. We do have a support person. I do have a support person with me, so as you think of questions along the way, you can certainly ask them, but I won't get around to answering them until the end. Okay, so let's begin. Chapter 5 is the discussion chapter. And I always urge people to get a hold of their school's template or any template that your school or your chair might want you to use. We are going to go over the general kind of requirements that are typically in Chapter 5 or the discussion chapter, but schools sometimes have variations on these, so it's always good to know exactly what your school is requiring. Okay. So the discussion chapter, people are sometimes confused, or they're not really sure what goes into it. They think it's kind of a repeat of the results. So let's just kind of clear up, what actually goes into the chapter. And these are the sections we'll be covering today: introduction, interpretation of the findings, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, summary. Again, get a hold of your school-specific template. Sometimes they'll call the sections maybe different things, but essentially the content should be pretty standard. Okay, the introduction usually begins with a restatement of your purpose. Remind the reader of the importance and the need for your study. You can also end the section by previewing contents, so the sections of the chapter. And basically the idea is just to kind of reorient your reader about your study and why it's important, why it's necessary to conduct. It doesn't need to be long. Probably a solid paragraph, maybe two. Some schools want you to summarize your findings in the introductory paragraph, but sometimes that's school specific. And if it's a summary of your findings, it doesn't mean to go into depth about them. It just means just kind of give a summary there in the introduction. The major, or really the heart of the chapter, the discussion chapter, is usually called something like the interpretation of the findings. And this is where people kind of get, they're kind of unsure about what's required in this section. Basically, what you're doing, the major component here is to see how your findings relate to the major findings of previous studies. And so here's some kind of steps to go about when you're setting up this section and writing this section. It's always good to organize the material somehow in this section, because it helps you as a writer to kind of organize your thoughts. It also helps the reader to follow along and to kind of make sense of what you're saying. So it's usually a good idea to make subheaders based on your RQs if it's quantitative, or themes if it's qualitative. Again, this helps you kind of take one thing at a time and not kind of get all your findings kind of jumbled together, because you're going to also be bringing in literature from chapter 2. So restate or lay out your findings, for example, research question 1 or your first theme. Summarize it, talk a little bit about it, and then this is where you want to kind of bring in, go back to chapter 2, see what the major findings are in this area of your finding or your theme, and you want to note whether your findings align with previous research, whether they don't align, or maybe they might add something entirely new, which is also worth noting. Sometimes findings may be mixed in the literature, so your findings will agree with some things and not other things. But where your findings align with previous literature, the findings of previous literature, you can make conclusions based on that. Where your findings don't align, that suggests some degree of inconclusiveness. And usually when your findings don't align, it's appropriate to discuss or briefly explain why you think your findings might not align with the research. Sometimes it has something to do with maybe you studied a different population, or it could be something maybe methodologically due to a weakness, or it could be just something that is in the literature that helps you explain something about your study that may have led to different results. Okay, limitations. This is basically where you talk about any weaknesses or shortcomings that may have affected the results of your study. You also want to talk about the generalizability of your results to other populations. So for limitations, typical limitations for, say, a quantitative study would be low sample size. That diminishes your statistical certainty. So low sample sizes for quantitative studies are a limitation. Sometimes if you can't sample the population, survey the population, you can't get the population you wanted or the sample you wanted, and you have to use a different set of participants, that can affect your results. Also, people recently, obviously the times that we're going through, COVID has affected research, and that's certainly a limitation to discuss if it has or has the potential to in your study. Maybe you can't do face-to-face interviews. Well, so you do Zoom interviews. That's good. But sometimes it's not always the same as being able to be in the same room with them, and the kind of nuances are different. And generalizability. Typically, in quantitative studies, if your sample is adequate, you have a large enough sample size, your generalizability should be pretty good. In qualitative studies necessarily require low sample sizes. I mean, sometimes you're interviewing 8 to 10 people. That's a low sample size, but it's required for qualitative studies. So an accepted limitation really of qualitative studies is that you will have a low sample size. The generalizability will not be good, but the whole trade-off is that you are getting in-depth information that you can't get with large sample size quantitative studies. So that's kind of a trade-off. It's something, if you're doing a qual study, you just need to mention and discuss. Again, your results are not going to generalize well because of the low sample size, but again, that's kind of by design. And again, the trade-off is to get this kind of in-depth information about people's experiences. Implications for practice. Basically, it's just like it sounds. You need to discuss, now that you have your findings and you've made some conclusions, what does that mean for professionals in your area? What does it mean at the level of practice? Right. So if you're doing some kind of education study, a teaching study or something, what then would your results mean for teachers or administrators, right? So, and usually you want to be as specific as possible, not kind of vague in general, but they should be based on your findings and be specific. Just to go back to that for a minute. So things, for example, if it has something to do with teaching, you could, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, but it might involve professional development for teachers. It might involve, seminars or workshops. So that's what I mean about the level of specificity. Okay. Recommendations for further research. Another important section. Recommendations should be based on your findings. They're not really general recommendations. They can also be based on limitations. So if you found something new, that would definitely warrant more research. If you found something that doesn't align with previous research, that could warrant more research because it suggests a degree of inconclusiveness. Recommendations based on limitations. If you did a quantitative study and you didn't get an adequate sample size, you can recommend replicating the study with an adequate sample size. If something happened because of COVID and you couldn't do something you wanted to, you could recommend replicating the study, but doing it properly and addressing the limitations. So recommendations can be based on your findings or your limitations. You can also recommend different types of studies to get different kinds of information. For example, if you did a quantitative study and it confirmed the relationship between two factors or two variables, to get more information on that relationship, you could recommend a mixed methods study that does quantitative and qualitative, or a qualitative study to get more comprehensive view of it, or a case study. So different types of studies can give you different types of information, and you can recommend, again, different types of studies for those purposes. In summary or a conclusion, check your school's template. Some schools just let you end with the recommendations for future research. Some schools want a summary. And basically a summary should at the end of your dissertation, right? It's the very end, it's the culmination. Recap major points from the chapter, but also, leave the reader with a message, the most important things from your study that you want them to remember. And that's kind of it. The chapter 5, they're not typically, real long, there's no really page count requirements. You just need to hit those areas and make sure you have, what your template is asking for. Whoops. Okay, and that's our contact information. That's what I wanted. Okay, and really that's about it. They're not difficult. They're just a little tricky to understand what they're asking for in the discussion chapter, but once you kind of get your head around that, it seems to proceed better. Right. And we do have a question here. It says, do we help with editing? Yeah, so as part of the what's covered in the services, obviously we consult with you, we guide you on the chapter. You draft a chapter, we look it over, we edit, we give the thing a good edit, we address what we can on our end, and usually there's additional input needed from you, clarifications, things that may be working or not working, and we leave comments on those and suggestions, and we work with you to strengthen up the document that way. But yes, we do editing. To the second slide. The cost of the services that will need to be, you need to talk to somebody in a consultation about the cost of services. Let's see, somebody has a question about the second slide, was on how to present the findings. Can you talk more about how to do that with mixed methods? There's a slide, right. Yeah, if it's mixed methods, you kind of have to talk about the quant portion and the qual portion and then kind of synthesize that. And they're always, and all studies are different and mixed methods are a little different. So you kind of have to see what your template says, but generally, you want to cover, both sets of findings and kind of bring them together to help make your points. And you may need a separate section to kind of blend the findings, or show how, say, the qualitative findings support the quantitative findings, or how they add to it. Okay, and someone asked, do you know the average turnaround time for editing? You know, all jobs are different, and that can be worked out in your initial consult. But our standard turnaround time for an initial draft, to get an initial draft back to you after we receive it from you, is about 2 weeks. And subsequent drafts after that is about a week. But these schedules sometimes can be, it depends on the specialist, what their schedules are, but that's generally our turnaround times. Okay, great. Well, thank you for attending. And we run the Suneen Right all the time on different chapters and topics, the dissertation.
Yeah. There are a total of 8 webinars that are live hosted each month. It's actually 4 different topics, but those 4 topics are hosted twice through the month. And you're welcome to, of course, register for any one of them. They are all recorded. After the session ends, we download the recording, we send it out to everyone, and then you will also get a copy of the PowerPoint. I'll go ahead and post the link to the general registration so you guys have that. And that way you can go on there and take a look at those. And it looks like actually that archive has some information about the upcoming as well, if you scroll down past anything that's been archived. All right, and then I mean, there are some questions that are just a little more specific as far as the assistance we provide. So you have the contact information on the slide that's currently posted. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the services, the turnaround times, the cost, anything like that, please send us an email to info@statistics-solutions, and we'll be in touch to get a consultation scheduled.
Great. Thank you very much for attending. Have a great day.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.